In this video, I want to show you how the situation in Cuba has reached critical levels. From daily shortages to massive migration, we'll explore what's really happening on the island and why thousands of Cubans are making desperate decisions. We'll analyze every aspect of this crisis so you can understand why Cuba is at a point of no return. Cuba, an island rich in culture, history, and landscapes. But behind that natural beauty, there's a harsh reality that has been looming for decades. Years of economic crisis have brought the country to the brink of collapse, and the outlook does not seem to improve. Today, we'll examine why Cuba is immersed in such a complicated situation, and most importantly, why there doesn't seem to be a near solution. I'll tell you what's happening in Cuba, not just with data and figures, but from a human perspective. Imagine what it's like to live in a place where blackouts can last up to 14 hours a day, where finding food is a challenge and where the lack of water is a constant issue. In an ideal world, a country in crisis has options. Many would turn to the International Monetary Fund, IMF, an organization that essentially functions as a collective fund. Countries contribute money so that, in critical situations, anyone can ask for help. But Cuba has a complicated history with the IMF. We have to go back to the 1960s when Fidel Castro requested a loan from the IMF. Although the loan was repaid, the relationship between Cuba and the IMF ended on bad terms. Castro harshly criticized the IMF's conditions, a stance that has since marked the island, distancing it from this possible economic aid. And today, in the midst of a crisis, Cuba does not have the option of turning to the IMF for financial rescue. But it's not just the IMF. Cuba also lacks access to the World Bank and other international financial institutions that could offer solutions. This means that, unlike other countries in crisis, Cuba faces its problems without the support of these organizations. There's a deeper problem here, more serious than it may seem at first glance. Cuba does not produce what it needs to support its population. As an island, it relies heavily on imports to cover basic needs from food to essential goods. And without enough resources to pay for these imports, the country finds itself at a crossroads. Imagine, for example, having to depend on others for your daily food, energy, or water needs. That is the reality for thousands of Cubans. And when a country doesn't generate enough income to buy what it needs, its citizens' quality of life plummets. One of the most critical issues in Cuba is the lack of electricity. We're talking about daily blackouts, some lasting up to 14 hours. And if you think that's just a nuisance, imagine what it means for a business to halt production day after day due to a lack of power. Imagine a family having to deal with entire nights without light, unable to even use a fan during the hot summer. But where does this problem stem from? The story is complex and has its roots in how Cuba's electrical system was structured. Until 1959, the island's main trading partner was the United States. With geographical proximity, Cuba maintained a good economic relationship with this country. However, when Fidel Castro took power, he chose to align with the Soviet Union and distance himself from the United States, a radical change with massive consequences. For decades, Cuba depended on Soviet oil to power its plants. But in 1991, with the fall of the Soviet Union, everything changed. Cuba lost its primary oil supplier and had to seek alternatives. That's where Venezuela comes into play. Venezuela, with its vast oil reserves and ideological affinity with Cuba, became the new lifeline. For years, the Caribbean nation received Venezuelan oil at low prices, allowing Cuba to maintain its power system. However, this dependency brought a new problem. When Venezuela began facing its own economic crisis, the oil supply was drastically reduced. Now, Cuba has to buy oil on the international market, and that's expensive. Very expensive. Nowadays, few countries build oil-based power plants because it's one of the most costly ways to generate electricity. This leaves Cuba in an extremely vulnerable position. Without enough money and without the cheap oil it once received from the Soviet Union, and then Venezuela, it cannot maintain its power system, resulting in constant blackouts. If you thought the lack of electricity was enough, there's another issue that worsens the situation: water scarcity. More than 600,000 Cubans face water supply problems. Imagine having to ration every drop in the 21st century, not because of a drought, but because the system is so deteriorated that they simply can't pump the necessary water. Officials blame the poor condition of the pipes and the lack of fuel for the water pumps. Old pipes are riddled with leaks, and many need urgent repairs, but without funds to replace or repair these systems, the crisis worsens. And as if that weren't enough, the water issue directly impacts food production. Food production in Cuba has plummeted. For example, in 2024, less than 4,000 tons of pork were produced, far below what's needed to feed the population. This food shortage has led to rampant inflation, and many people simply cannot afford basic necessities. The bleak landscape in Cuba has triggered a massive exodus of people. Between 2022 and 2023, the island's population dropped drastically. Many people are seeking a better life in other countries, especially the United States, and this trend seems likely to continue. This exodus is affecting Cuba's population pyramid alarmingly. Today, most Cubans are between 55 and 59 years old, which means that in the near future, a large number of people will be reaching retirement age. With fewer young people contributing to the pension system, the government will face serious challenges in supporting its aging population. It's a cycle that seems endless. In recent years, many Cubans have started using dollars instead of Cuban pesos. This isn't just a preference, it's a necessity. On the street, the dollar holds more value than the Cuban peso, which has led to a black market for currency that the government cannot control. Recently, the government has accepted a partial dollarization of the economy, allowing the use of dollars in sectors such as tourism. However, most transactions within the country are still conducted in Cuban pesos, creating an economic divide. The population needs dollars to access certain goods and services, but the government cannot afford full dollarization, as this would further reduce its control over the economy. In an attempt to boost the economy, Cuba began allowing private businesses in 2021. This provided some relief, allowing private companies to import food and other necessary goods. However, this sector has grown so much that the government now sees it as a threat to its control. Today, the private sector represents 20% of the economy, and it's estimated that in 2023 they imported $1.3 billion in goods. However, this activity has been criticized by the government, which accuses entrepreneurs of tax evasion and contributing to dollar inflation in the black market. In response, they've begun imposing restrictions, fining companies, and limiting the number of goods they can sell. It's as if the Cuban government is fighting itself. On one hand, it needs private sector support, but on the other, it fears losing control. It's inevitable to wonder what will happen to Cuba in the coming years. The economic crisis, lack of resources, and youth brain drain are problems that seem endless. Will the country find a solution? Or will this cycle of poverty, scarcity, and external dependence continue? In my opinion, unless drastic measures are taken, the situation in Cuba will only worsen. Without the support of international organizations and with a government limiting private initiative, it's difficult to see a way out. The road won't be easy, but hope never dies. Cuba is at a crucial moment, and the world is watching closely. The question is, will they make the necessary decisions to change course? Only time will tell, and if you want to discover what successful people do that many others don't know about, I invite you to watch this video on screen where I explain the 5 key habits that can change your financial life. Click now and join me in uncovering these secrets step by step. See you there.